didn't raise my boy to be a soldier. I brought him up to be my pride and joy. Who dared to place a musket on his shoulder to shoot some other mother's darling boy. Let nations operate their future trouble. It's time to lay the sword and gun away. There'd be no war today if mothers all would say, I didn't raise my boy to be a soldier.
The United States was how many empires were fighting?
My name's Eliza Canty-Jones. I work here at the Oregon Historical Society, and I'm so pleased to welcome you here to the second in our World War I Centennial series. I want to welcome you so much here to the Oregon Historical Society, where our mission is to preserve our state's history and make it accessible to everyone in ways that advance knowledge and inspire curiosity about all the peoples, places, and events that have shaped Oregon. We do this work in a lot of ways, public programs like this one, of course. The exhibits here in our downtown location, we have 3 floors of exhibits, some permanent, some changing. We have school groups and tours that come in and are led by docents here in the museum. 7 days a week we're open. We have funding that makes it possible so that schools can have transportation costs covered, and the admission for school groups is always free. I just want to emphasize that so that if folks have kids or work with educators, you know that there's ways to make sure that the students and the groups can get here to OHS, and funding shouldn't be a problem for that. We also have, our education department creates traveling trunks that go out around the state about different aspects of Oregon history and into classrooms all over Oregon. You can access amazing Oregon history all the time online at ohs.org and at oregonencyclopedia.org and oregonhistoryproject.org and the oregonwayfinder.org. These are all fantastic resources, and they are, the Oregon Encyclopedia is peer-reviewed and fact-checked. The Oregon History Project puts over 1,000 primary source documents from our research collection online with contextual headnotes, so make great use of those as well. Our research library holds the most important and, of course, the largest collection related to the history of the Oregon country anywhere in the world, and it's publicly accessible, open 32 hours a week. You don't need to make an appointment. Just check out the hours and come on in and do your research. Of course, we also publish the Oregon Historical Quarterly and have done so continuously since 1900, creating a very bulky and important resource that gives us access to Oregon history for 118 years. We're in our 118th volume year now. So that resource is available to you in our research library, through JSTOR and the Multnomah County Library, and of course members have it mailed directly to them every 3 months, so take advantage of that. We're supported in a variety of ways by the state of Oregon, by individual donors and corporate sponsors and granting agencies, by our members. There's some members in the house tonight, I expect, yes? Yeah, you're not. Yeah, clap for yourselves. We're so grateful for our members. Thanks very much for that great support. We give thanks to our members in a few ways. That subscription to OHQ, discounts in the OHS Museum Store, first shot at tickets to speakers and discounts, and invitations to our parties and all that kind of good thing. Also, we can't thank enough the good voters of Multnomah County who last year renewed a modest property tax levy that supports us and 4 smaller historical societies in East Multnomah County. This stable, predictable, generous funding has done so much for us at the Oregon Historical Society. So thank you, Multnomah County. Yes. And be sure to take advantage of the Multnomah County residents get discounts on membership and free admission to the museum and research library. So please take advantage of that. I should also note we're really supported by our volunteers as well, who make a lot of the work at OHS happen. So thanks to all our volunteers. Tonight's program, volunteers. Tonight's program is part of our Centennial World War I series, which will continue next month on May 17th and 18th with a panel discussion on citizenship and civil liberties on the World War I home front. This will feature historians Dr. Kimberly Jensen, Dr. Adrian Lentz-Smith, and Dr. Stephen Sabal. There's more information in the pamphlet in the back. And then in June, the Oregon Historical Quarterly will publish a special section of essays by World War I scholars, including the 2 speakers who you'll hear from tonight. and several more who will tell us various ways of understanding really the legacy and the ongoing significance of World War I. And Drs. Kimberly Jensen and Christopher Nichols have generously written an introduction to go with these essays. We're so pleased to be able to bring you these excellent historians. And also, as part of our World War I series, we're really thrilled. Our June issue will feature a new research article by Kimberly Jensen on the practice of female citizenship and the expanding surveillance state during and after the war. I am wearing an artifact from that surveillance state right now, a pen for the Victory Loan, which all of you members, when you read this article in June, you'll understand exactly what I'm talking about. And that scholarship, I should note, is supported in part by the Sterling Fellowship, which supports research here at OHS and our research library. So, hooray. Yes, Sterling Fellowship. So we'll introduce our two speakers and then let them go. Michael Kazin is a professor of history at Georgetown University and editor of Dissent magazine. He is the author of 6 books about politics and social movements in the United States, including available for sale this evening, War Against War, The American Fight for Peace, 1914 to 1918. He's a regular contributor to Foreign Affairs, the New York Times, Politico, The Nation, and other periodicals and websites. Importantly, he also earned his MA at Portland State University, like a few of us in the room. And Michael Hellquist is a public historian, journalist, and activist who has worked extensively in the anti-war, economic and social justice, and LGBTQ movements. He has published in several periodicals. He received the 2016 Joel Palmer Award for the best article published in the Oregon Historical Quarterly the previous year. And he is the author of the book available for sale in the museum store this evening, Marie Equi, Radical Politics and Outlaw Passions. That was published by OSU Press in 2015. Just say I had the opportunity to hear Dr. Kazin speak at PSU this afternoon, and he emphasized the quality of empathy in historians and the significance of historians needing to work to understand the people that they are researching and writing about, even and especially when they don't always agree with those people. And I was so pleased to hear him say that. It resonated quite a bit with me, and so I'm excited to hear what he has to say tonight. And I did also think, having read Michael Hellquist's book on Marie Equi, of what a wonderful way that he brings empathy to his work. So we are in good hands tonight. Let me turn it over to the historians.
Good evening. Can you hear me okay? Thanks, Eliza, for that nice introduction. It's great to be back in Portland, and especially at the Historical Society, where I did research for my MA thesis, which has been read by at least 20 people, maybe more. It was entitled Irish Families in Portland, Oregon, 1850 to 1880. I did my research in the parish registers of the Catholic Church. If I remember, there was only one at the time. Maybe there were 2, but only one really big one in Portland. So it got me started as a historian. And if it wasn't for Portland and PSU and the Historical Society, I wouldn't be here today. So maybe I'd be in the audience listening. So, this book, as you know from the title, is about the Americans who opposed World War I, opposed both preparing to go to war, that is, building up the American military to the size of the militaries in the powers fighting already in Europe and in the Middle East. Most of you know the World War I began August 1914, and the United States didn't enter it until April 1917. And in fact, the United States American soldiers, the doughboys as they were called, only really fought serious combat in that war for the last 5 or 6 months of the war. So even though World War I was an incredibly critical event in the history of the world in the 20th century and beyond, for that matter, countries called Syria and Iraq were formed after World War I. You've probably heard of them, and some of the conflicts in those countries which are ongoing, some which stem actually from divisions during World War I. But most Americans don't think a lot about World War I. I'm really happy that the OHS is doing a whole series of talks about the war, because this is in many ways a forgotten war for many Americans, and it certainly does not deserve to be a forgotten war. So the people I've talked about are people who tried to stop the U.S. from getting into the war. And we can, perhaps in the question period, argue whether they were right or not to do that. But the book empathizes, certainly, with what they did and tries to explain what they did and who they were. And let me start by showing you photos of 4 of the leaders of key parts of this anti-war coalition, who again proposed preparing for war and then opposed going to war itself. Only one of these figures might be familiar to you. Certainly only one is very familiar to most American historians. Robert La Follette, senator from Wisconsin, a progressive Republican, leader of Midwestern Republicans in the Senate. Then Crystal Eastman. How many people have ever heard of Crystal Eastman? A savvy crowd here. So. Well, for those who haven't heard of her, she was a feminist, a suffragist, a socialist, though her socialism was not one of the main parts of her identity. And she was a key organizer in 2 of the leading groups in the anti-war coalition. The Women's Peace Party of New York, which was the largest contingent of a larger Women's Peace Party, which was headed by Jane Addams, the famous social worker and pacifist and women's rights campaigner. The Women's Peace Party had 40,000 members at its height, which would be equal to about 120,000 members today in America. And they had chapters all over the country, but the New York one was the largest one. And a second group, which Crystal Eastman also ran, called the American Union Against Militarism. Not the most mellifluous name, the AUAM as it was known, which was organized social workers and labor organizers, as well as pacifists against going to war, and had a very active lobby in Washington trying to get lawmakers from both parties to not support enlarging the military. Third, Morris Hillquit, a leading socialist at a time when the Socialist Party was quite strong in the United States, the strongest it's ever been in American history, with over 120,000 members in 1912 and over 1,000 elected officials between 1900 and 1920. Hillquit was fluent in 4 languages. He'd been born in Riga, Latvia. He was Jewish. He was a labor attorney in New York City. And he was the key conduit between American socialists and their comrades in Europe, many of whom had supported the war, gone along with their governments in supporting the war. And also, one of his claims to fame is that in 1917, after the U.S. had already declared war, in November 1917 to be precise, Hillquit ran for mayor of New York City, the second largest city in the world at the time, after London, and received 25% of the vote as a socialist who was opposed to the war. And this is the time, as many of you know, and I'll talk about it if I have time in my remarks, and I'm sure Michael will as well, when there was the most repressive regime against civil liberties in American history. This was a man who ran for mayor of New York, won a quarter of the vote almost in a 4-man race, and Woodrow Wilson, President Woodrow Wilson, of course, had taken the United States into war by then, was afraid that he would actually win the mayoralty on this platform, so afraid that he and those in the Justice Department he appointed talked about actually arresting him for violating the Espionage Act, which was passed basically to try to get people to stop denouncing the war in 1917. They didn't do that because they thought it would make him into a martyr, it might increase his vote. But this made him into a key figure in the movement after the U.S. declared war, as well as he was before the war was declared. And finally, a figure who most of my fellow historians have never heard of, Claude Kitchin. How many people have ever heard of Claude Kitchin? Aha, got you there. Claude Kitchin was a congressman from North Carolina. He was one of the key figures in North Carolina in the late 1890s in driving black voters away from the polls through terrorism, in helping to pass a disenfranchisement law in the North Carolina legislature. So he was, from what we think today, a very bad guy. However, he was also a populist with a small p. He opposed what he saw as big business, especially in the Northeast, driving Americans into war. He was one of the 50 congresspeople in the House who voted against going to war. And he was a very popular man among his fellow Democrats. He was not just majority leader of the House of Representatives, he was also the chair of the Ways and Means Committee, which, as most of you know, is a tax writing committee in the House. So these 4 figures represented 4 important parts of this coalition. Southern Democrats on the one hand, Midwestern Republicans, or progressive Republicans like La Follette on the other hand, the Socialist Party, and unions, which were very close to the Socialist Party, which included the United Mine Workers, for example, one of the largest unions in America at the time, and the feminist and suffrage movements, which were growing and very powerful at the time, too. Well, I haven't got time to go into the sort of history of how the U.S. went into the war, but from the hands that were raised, I bet a lot of you know about it already. But important to realize that this movement that opposed going to war was, first of all, not full of isolationists, as some of the conventional wisdom has it. All these figures, especially La Follette and Eastman and Hillquit, all believed the United States had to be deeply involved in the world. They all had close connections with people, progressives, socialists, feminists, in Europe especially. And what they wanted for a better world was not so different in many ways from what Woodrow Wilson wanted, what Woodrow Wilson talked about. They wanted a world made safe for democracy, as Wilson put it in his speech in April 2nd, 1917, calling for the U.S. to get into the war. They wanted self-determination for nations which were part of empires, as Wilson talked about in his 14-point speech in January 1918. They just didn't think the U.S. going to war was the best way to achieve those ends. And they actually met quite often, to Eastman and all these figures, except La Follette, with Wilson in the White House. And he seemed like he was on their side very often, until he was not on their side. And also they were opposed by a very powerful counter-movement, a pro-war movement, if you will, a pro-preparedness movement, and then a pro-war movement, of whom the most important figure, the best-known figure, was this guy in the center that, if you're history buffs, you can easily recognize, the former president, Theodore Roosevelt, still a very popular figure. He was a leading figure in the pro-preparedness movement, and there was a big, well-financed organization called the National Security League, which he helped to lead and promote a movement of several thousand people, many of whom were quite wealthy, which had held rallies all over the country, often rallies held a day before or day after the peace movement was holding rallies. So you had these competing movements, in other words. One wanting the United States to get into the war sooner than it did, one trying to stop the U.S. from ever getting into the war. Now Wilson, of course, in the beginning of the war was very much a neutral figure. He gave a speech soon after the war began, late August 1914, where he said these words, that Americans had to be neutral in thought as well as deed. But in fact, and this is a little controversial, I don't think Wilson was ever truly neutral. In fact, he was willing to allow American corporations and American investment houses like J.P. Morgan and Company to do a very good trade with the British and the French, the Allied powers, two of the main Allied powers, beginning in early 1915, all the way up until when war was declared. And personally, Wilson was always pro-British, for familial reasons as well as other ones. His mother had been born in Carlisle, England. His greatest political heroes were the great British philosopher and politician Edmund Burke and the great liberal William Gladstone. And the Lake District in England was his favorite place on earth. And even though he devoutly wanted the United States to be a broker for a good peace before the U.S. became part of the Allied powers in 1917, he was made very clear to his closest associates, like Colonel House, his closest advisor on foreign policy, that he would have been appalled by a German victory. So he wanted to make sure the Germans didn't win, even though he also believed, until the United States went into the war, that at some point he could be an honest broker between the two powers. Now, again, as I said, most Americans who fought and died in the war actually fought and died in one battle, one single battle, in the Meuse-Argonne, which began in September 1917 and ended on Armistice Day, November 11th, 1917. It is the bloodiest battle in American history, actually, more than D-Day, more than Antietam. So it wasn't really, and the U.S. won the battle, but this was towards the end of the war, and the Germans were in retreat anyway, towards the last month or so of the battle anyway. What made the difference in the war the way the United States actually was the key factor in German defeat was that 2 million American troops were in France by the summer of 1918. And by the way, this is corrected, sorry. I thought it said 1917. And by the end of 1918, early 1919, if the war continued, another 2 million Americans could have been there. Think about what that meant for an exhausted English, British, German, Austro-Hungarian armies. Men often who'd fought for 2 or 3 years, who'd been in the trenches, who'd suffered from gas attacks, many of whose friends had died. French troops were mutinying already in 1917, early 1917. The Russians had already left the war at the end of 1917 after the Bolshevik Revolution. And here you have 2 to 4 million fresh American troops, mostly gung-ho for the fight. The Germans knew they couldn't go against that. So in early 1918, before all those American troops got to France, the Germans undertook what were really their final offensives. They got close to Paris, didn't take Paris, and when they were pushed back, that was basically the end of the war. So US troops, US involvement made the difference in the war, though not in the actual combat, but in the specter, if you will, the threat of all these fresh American troops, which the Germans knew they could not withstand. But to go back to the anti-war movement very quickly, some of the key elements. First of all, the first, in many ways, most important group which was starting the movement in 1914, very soon after the war began in Europe, were women, feminists and suffragists who staged the first anti-war march in World War I. And one of the first anti-war marches in American history, actually. Down Fifth Avenue in New York City, about 2,000 women, many wearing black to symbolize mourning. Over 20,000 New Yorkers lined Fifth Avenue to watch them. It was a silent march. It was a march that no flags were allowed to be held. Women from the different belligerent countries, Russia and Austria-Hungary and Germany and Belgium and France and England, wore dresses, costumes of their countries, but nobody was allowed to wave flags. This was a powerful symbol and demonstration of the idea that many feminists had at the time, that said that wars were made by men, only women could stop them. That really was the message of this demonstration. And they continued to push this. The Women's Peace Party, as I mentioned before, was founded in in Washington, D.C. in February 1915. It was led by Jane Addams, a woman there in the center. A month later, she led a delegation of Americans to go to The Hague, the capital of neutral Netherlands, where they headed up a women's peace conference where they hoped to convince the warring powers to listen to women. Later on, Jane Addams and other Americans who went to this conference went on a tour of war capitals in Europe, meeting with prime ministers, meeting with foreign secretaries, meeting with war secretaries, trying to convince them to come to a peace conference. And of course, they failed. But it shows you the power of feminism at this point in American history, that they were not just pushing for suffrage and women's rights at home, they were pushing for peace in the whole world. And another symbol of how powerful this feminist message was the most popular song in America in 1915 was this song, "I Didn't Raise My Boy to Be a Soldier." 800,000 copies of the sheet music were sold in that one year. It was heard in music halls and homes and maybe even churches around the country in that year. Now, the movement continued to grow beyond those circles, included settlement house workers like Lillian Wald in New York City, Paul Kellogg, the editor of one of the most important reform magazines in America called The Survey, included Stephen Wise, who was the most influential rabbi in America, who also lived in New York, included many labor union officials and labor union members, perhaps as much as half of the American Federation of Labor, which was the leading labor federation of the country in the World War I period, opposed preparedness and opposed going to war, even though the president of the American Federation of Labor, Samuel Gompers, did not. As I said, as the movement blossomed, it continued to pick up support in Congress through 1915 and 1916, including this guy who was not in Congress, William Jennings Bryan, but who was almost as popular a Democrat as the President of the United States, Woodrow Wilson. Bryan, as you probably know, ran for president 3 times, lost all 3 times, but nevertheless was kind of a hero to many rank-and-file Democrats, especially those from the South and the West. And he was Woodrow Wilson's first Secretary of State in 1913, 1915. 1915, he resigned as Secretary of State in protest against what he thought was the Wilson administration's move towards going to war with Germany after a German U-boat torpedoed the Lusitania, which most of you probably heard about. Eric Larson's recent book does a wonderful job of narrating that sinking. So this was a rare event in American history where a Secretary of State resigns his office on a matter of principle. He was the first one in American history to do so. Anybody know who the second one was? Very good, Cyrus Vance. 1979. There's only been 2. So also opposing the war were many ethnic Americans. America in World War I, the population was 1/3 of all Americans were either immigrants or their children. Higher percentage than now, highest percentage in American history except for the 1840s, early 1850s. And this is another demonstration, another illustration of that. This is a anti-war meeting held soon before the war was declared in February 1917, held at the Jewish Daily Forward building in Lower Manhattan, the leading Jewish newspaper in America. 250,000 copies a day sold in Yiddish. And you see the speakers, some in English, some in Yiddish, some in Italian, some in Russian, and they could have added other languages as well. But those are the major languages spoken in Manhattan, at least at the time. And a rather unlikely, perhaps, member of the anti-war coalition was this guy, Henry Ford, the most popular businessman in America because of his creation of the Model T Ford and the $5 a day wage at his plant in Highland Park, Michigan. Henry Ford believed that war was criminal. He at one point said that the word murderer should be emblazoned in red on the uniform of every soldier. Imagine someone saying that today. He wanted to sort of put his money where his mouth was. And in December 1915, he chartered a ship, filled it with hundreds of pacifists and journalists, and went over to Europe, to Norway, trying to do what Jane Addams and her sisters, pacifists, had done a few months before. That is, try to get the neutral nations to start a peace conference. He failed at that, as they had failed as well. What motivated all these people? See how much time I've got here. Not much. What motivated all these people? 2 things, I think, primarily. First of all, they were populists with a small p, most of them. They believed that war was only benefited the rich, only benefited industrialists, only benefited big investment houses, and they thought that a well-armed, militarized America was going to be more and more run for the rich, who, after all, war, if you think about it, is good business, whether it's a good war or not a good war, because the stuff you produce for war gets blown up and you have to make more of it. So it is a good business in a very practical sense. That's not necessarily why people go to war, of course. Here's a cartoon by Art Young, a left-wing cartoonist from the Masses magazine in New York, a very graphic, in-your-face illustration of that point of view. But also, most of these people who were activists also, as I said before, they were idealists. They were not just angry at those who might get the U.S. into war. They also believed that war would not get you to peace. Only pushing the idea of peaceful settlements, mediation, arbitration, peace treaties, peace conferences would bring about peace. War, they argue, would just lead to more wars. And also they believe that a well-armed America, whether it went to war or not, would destroy many things I liked about the country. Whether or not they were on the left or conservatives, they believed, as Senator William Stone, the chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, who voted against the war, another Democrat voting against the war, being pushed by a president of his own party, that if we go into this war, we will never again have the same old republic. So they foresaw the beginning of the national surveillance state, the beginning of the national warfare state, the beginning of what Dwight D. Eisenhower famously said, called in his farewell address in 1961, the military-industrial complex. Again, whether you support the war or not, whether you think the war was a good thing or not, I think they were prophetic about that. I don't want to take too much time away from Michael and away from questions and debate. Let me just mention a couple of the aspects of the war and the anti-war, if you will, which are less familiar to a lot of people, I think. One is the draft. Draft began in June 1917, and some of the literature about the war, I think this is true even with the PBS series on World War I, if you saw that, at least parts of it the other night, makes it seem as if, well, yes, there was a lot of feeling against the war, but the draft was pretty popular, went off without much disruption. Millions of men registered, those who were called up, didn't try to get out of it. Very different from the Vietnam era. Not true. As many as 3 million men never registered for the draft at all, of draft age, who were legally obligated to register. About 350,000 men who registered for the draft never reported to their camps as required, or actually deserted from their camps. This was true for black Americans in fairly large numbers who often weren't happy about fighting in a war to make the world safe for democracy when they didn't enjoy democracy at home. It also included, however, many white small farmers in the South and elsewhere, and wage earners who didn't like taking part in what they called a rich man's war and a poor man's fight. Taken together, a higher percentage of American men chose to resist conscription during World War I than during the Vietnam War a century later. This is a rather shocking fact when you think about how much anti-war activity, how much anti-draft activity there was during the Vietnam War. Second thing, which of course pretty much everybody knows, is that the war was a great disillusioning experience for most Americans. Woodrow Wilson goes to Paris in 1919 to arrive at a peace agreement with the British and the French and the Italians, which he believes will bring about a much better world, a world made safe for democracy, perhaps to arrive at a peace without victory, which he'd called for in a famous speech before the U.S. declared war. He agrees, he gets the other allied powers to agree to set up a League of Nations in Geneva, and the main building of the League of Nations is named the Palais Wilson. But then, in 1919, he comes back home and fails to sell the peace treaty to the U.S. Senate, which by then is led by the chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, which the Republicans now control, Henry Cabot Lodge, who hated Woodrow Wilson more than he hated any person he'd ever met. To read the letters between Henry Cabot Lodge and Theodore Roosevelt, who were best friends, about Woodrow Wilson is, it's a good thing Wilson never saw them, because he would have hated them just as much as they hated him. And Lodge was determined to make sure that Wilson did not get his peace treaty, and he did not get his peace treaty. And that leads me to a conclusion about the war, which is one of the reasons I think most Americans don't know much about it and don't think much about it. Why we don't, for example, have a World War I memorial on the Mall in Washington, D.C. We have a Vietnam memorial, we have a World War II memorial, a very big one, of course, Korean War memorial, of course, the Vietnam memorial, which is an amazing, remarkable piece of public sculpture, I believe. But there's no World War I memorial, and there's going to be one built at some point, a very small one, but not on the Mall, away from the Mall, in a very small park called Pershing Park, after General John Pershing, who was head of American forces in World War I. Well, why is that? I think one of the reasons is that the war had ambiguous beginnings for the United States and an ambiguous ending. Most Americans don't know exactly why the U.S. entered the war. It wasn't because America was attacked. It wasn't because there was a fear that the Germans would somehow get over here with their biplanes and bomb New York. And also, as I said before, American history of combat in World War I was quite brief. More Americans died in uniform away from the battlefield, many from the Spanish flu, which was a terrible epidemic in 1918 and 1919, than died on the battlefield. And also, because of the defeat of the Versailles Treaty and what happened afterwards, the rise of fascism and Bolshevism, and of course World War II, beginning only 22 years after the end of World War I, many Americans perhaps are aware, if they take history courses, that the United States won the war but lost the peace. And so we don't have a satisfying moral tale about the consequences of U.S. intervention. And so perhaps the lack of historical memory about the war is not too surprising. But I wrote this book because I think the war is worth remembering and discussing and analyzing much more, and those who opposed the war, who I think, in retrospect, were right to do so, also are worth understanding and respecting and understanding. And in general, I think we should think more about those who oppose wars in this country as well as those who fight them, as much as we should respect their service. Because if you think about it, the United States has been at war a majority of the years of its history, if you include the wars against Native Americans, which I think one has to include. But we know a lot about those wars, but not so much about those who oppose them. And I wrote the book to at least shed some light on those who oppose one very big war. Thank you.
Well, thanks to Eliza for the introduction and to the Oregon Historical Society for sponsoring tonight's presentation. I've really appreciated the several years that I've had to be working with OHS, and I'm amazed at how much the organization pushes the boundaries of how we understand history, the story of Oregon and the Pacific Northwest, and of ourselves. I'm honored to be speaking tonight with Dr. Kazin. I read the book. I strongly recommend it. I want to thank my husband, Dale Danley, who's my research and writing collaborator, and thank you all for being here tonight. Earlier today, as I was doing another run through my talk, or right afterwards, I was visiting my mother. I'm a native Portlander, but I live in San Francisco now. But I was visiting my mother in Southeast Portland, and of course I realized that I'm about to talk this evening about something that happened in 1917 and beyond, and that's the year my mother was born. So it just had even so much more resonance for me of the importance and the sense of history of what we're looking at. While researching the life of Dr. Marie Equi, one of Oregon's best-known agitators during the early 20th century, I became intrigued with how the state executed the Espionage and Sedition Acts during World War I. I wondered, how did the criminalization of dissent ripple through Oregon's cities and communities? How much did citizens cooperate with government surveillance, and which Oregonians were targeted, and who was arrested? Now, historians have profiled a few Oregonians charged with disloyalty, but no comprehensive account exists of the sedition arrests, trials, and incarcerations in the state. Tonight, I'll present findings from my research that identify nearly 100 Oregonians swept up in the fervor and recriminations of the time. My study relies on a searchable digital archive of the Oregonian newspaper as its primary data source. The paper was the largest in the state then as well, and during this time frame, and the editors considered it their duty to report seditious incidents no matter where they occurred in the state. When the U.S. joined World War I in April 1917, Oregon seemed destined to grapple with wartime dissent. Lumber and shipbuilding made the state a vital war production center. The number of radicals was sizable enough to threaten war industries and shipping. Civic and business leaders wanted federal investment in wartime infrastructure, and they lobbied to outlaw radical organizing. And then finally, much of the public indulged in a hyper-patriotism that demanded adherence. The Wartime Espionage and Sedition Acts were adopted by Congress to stifle draft protests, to protect the vital war industries, and to squash any dissent. But at the same time, the federal government crafted a first time ever in the nation, a campaign to enlist citizens in surveillance of suspicious behavior. So here's how some of this played out in Oregon. From the spring of 1917 through the end of the war in November 1918, the Oregonian published nearly 200 reports about alleged disloyalty in the state. That averages more than 2 reports each week. The newspaper accounts detailed 99 arrests that occurred throughout the state in 18 counties, which you see here, and in 24 jurisdictions in those counties, ranging from small, unincorporated communities to the state cities. So, what are we to think of Oregon's 99 sedition arrests over a year and a half? 99 individuals charged with disloyalty in a state with a population of about 750,000 people. Is that a lot or not so many? Well, one thing to take into consideration is that for each arrest, there were probably dozens of investigations and home visits by federal agents to residents warning them to desist any seditious talk or activities. These didn't get reported in the newspaper, but were sort of under the radar, what was going on at the time. The actual arrests, plus those additional investigations, and the ripple effect on families, friends, and communities suggest a much greater impact. 1/3 of the 99 arrests were conducted by the U.S. Attorney in Oregon, along with the Bureau of Investigation, the early FBI, and a military intelligence unit. The primary targets were what might be called the usual suspects: political radicals opposed to the war and to the economic system. 29 were members of the Industrial Workers of the World, a radical union, or they were individuals aligned with the IWW. 5 were socialists. So of these 34 arrested, 14 were convicted and 3 pled guilty. It's possible there were more convictions that simply were not reported in the newspaper after the initial notice of arrest. So let's look first at the IWW. For more than 10 years, civic and corporate leaders from the Pacific Northwest, primarily meaning the governors and the congressional representatives, they had urged the federal government to silence or outlaw the largely working class Wobblies, as members of the IWW were called. With their free speech fights and labor strikes, the Wobblies threatened civil authority and industrial operations. Historian Adam J. Hodges argues that Portland was already, quote, at a fever pitch of class antagonism at the time of the war. He notes that the IWW was thriving in Oregon before the war, with 4 union locals in Portland alone and nearly 1,800 members. The Oregonian newspaper noted that with the wartime laws, quote, every day or two an IWW stumbles over the espionage law. It is a trap with sharp teeth. The trial of Peter Green, a Wobbly arrested in Portland, reflected the uncertain justice of many sedition trials. Green was the secretary of the Lumber Workers Industrial Union, Local 500 in Portland. he was arrested and transported to Chicago for the mass IWW trial of 1918. He was convicted, sentenced to 10 years in prison, and fined the staggering sum of $30,000. Historian Stephen M. Cohn reveals an admission by the Department of Justice that no evidence was presented in Green's trial to indicate that he had said or done anything against the war. The Department of Justice admitted this, the conviction held, he was sentenced to 10 years and $30,000. In July 1918, the U.S. Attorney in Oregon arrested M.J. Smith, secretary of IWW Local 400 in Portland, and his companion, Kate Kidwell. Their offense was simply distributing flyers about the sedition case of Dr. Marie Equi. The charges were probably dropped for insufficient evidence. Another individual, Anton Jacobson, was a Finnish man active with the IWW in Portland. He was charged with tearing up the U.S. flag during some incident. He pled guilty and was sentenced to 2 years at McNeil Island Penitentiary in Washington State. Dr. Marie Equi, the Portland physician and agitator aligned with the IWW, became the only Oregon woman convicted of sedition. 5 women were arrested. Equi's offenses included anti-war talks and objections to the Liberty Loan campaigns that she believed preyed on the working class. Her influence among the elite, as well as the working class, and her notoriety as an abortion provider and as a lesbian, certainly seemed to fuel more federal harassment and intimidation than usual. At times, 8 federal agents were assigned to her case. They wiretapped her office, raided her home and office, tracked her every move, and interrogated her friends and colleagues across the country. Her trial became one of the most closely followed in Oregon. Prosecutors maligned her morality and sexuality. The treatment she received as a woman reflected how much the Sedition Act was used to enforce gender norms as well as to protect national security. Equi was convicted, sentenced to 3 years at San Quentin Prison, and fined $3,000. Her broad base of supporters protested her conviction, and interestingly, their advocacy eventually prompted President Wilson to reduce her sentence from 3 years to 1 year and a day. So let's shift to the socialists. The Socialist Party in Oregon posed a lesser threat to wartime industries than the IWW, but federal and local officials were worried about the socialists' anti-war stance and its electoral strength in the state. The federal government arrested and imprisoned socialist leader Eugene Debs, so local socialists in Oregon certainly knew they would be targets as well. One of the 5 socialists arrested in the state was Floyd Ramp, a 35-year-old Roseburg attorney who had studied law at the University of Oregon and the University of Portland. He was also a farmer who made time to work as a socialist organizer. Ramp was slight, at 5'4" and 134 pounds, but he projected confidence to the point of bravado. Ramp's offense was an alleged attempt to cause insubordination and refusal of duty among a few servicemen. Later in life, Ramp described the incident as a casual interaction with the enlistees. These men had been teasing and joking with him while they were on the flatbed of a train going into town, and he was in a horse-drawn wagon taking cut wood to the depot. And at one point, they were joking at him and saying, give us a speech. So he did. And Ramp asked, why go to war with France? Let John D. Rockefeller fight his own war. And for that, later on he commented, these boys didn't give a damn what I said, as far as his being a threat or not. For that, he was arrested. Ramp consulted Portland attorney C.E.S. Wood about representing him in court, but Wood suggested he do it himself since he was an attorney. Ramp decided to do so and frequently sparred with the judge. But he was unable to persuade the jury that his anti-war remarks did not make him a disloyal citizen. He was convicted, sentenced to 2 years at McNeil Island, and fined $1,000. He completed the second half of his sentence at Leavenworth Penitentiary in Kansas. He later returned to his farm in Roseburg, married, and raised 2 children who graduated from the University of Oregon. Now, more is known about Ramp than many of the others arrested due to an oral history conducted in 1974 by Michael Kazin and another student. Thank you, Michael. The audio tapes of that recording, that interview, are archived here at OHS. These recordings are the only ones known to exist for any of the Oregonians arrested for sedition. George W. France was a 26-year-old storekeeper, farmer, and postmaster in the community of 10 Mile in Douglas County. He became the first Oregonian indicted for sedition. France held socialist beliefs and had dared to question why the U.S. became a combatant in World War I. He was arrested after distributing to young men a pamphlet titled, "War, What For?" He was convicted and sentenced to 13 months at McNeil Island. On the day of his incarceration, he appeared in a hat, suit, and tie, and wore gold cufflinks and a gold stick pin. After his prison sentence, France joined a small group that held religious services on Sunday mornings at the Multnomah County Jail. Then in 1920, he asked the warden at McNeil Island Penitentiary to allow him to return to where he had served and take part in the Christmas services, the religious services at the prison. His request was denied. The arrest of socialist Victor J. McCone under the Wartime Acts was not surprising, but the outcome of his arrest was rather unusual. McCone was the Portland-based secretary-treasurer of the Socialist Party of Oregon. He had been an active opponent of the wartime draft and had traveled to Lewiston, Idaho, to help the IWW with its threat of a general regional strike. After being arrested, McCone publicly resigned from the Socialist Party and disowned it. He claimed the socialists were actually anarchists and pro-German. Federal authorities then released him, but you might imagine Oregon socialists vilified him for hypocrisy and betrayal. Socialist agitator Kate Blatchley was the first woman in Oregon held under the Sedition Act. In her offense, in May 1918, she aroused people in Klamath Falls with a talk about the U.S. involvement in the war. Before her case was taken to trial, however, federal officials stepped back and decided that the zeal of citizens had probably exceeded the evidence at hand. They concluded that Blatchley had been the victim of misunderstanding and gossip. Indeed, a citizens committee in Klamath Falls had advised her to quit the city as she was someone, quote, suspected of entertaining seditious sentiments. It's like having a thought, right? The charges against her were dismissed. Another group, the war also exposed religious fault lines in the state. 9 Oregonians with religious objections to war were arrested for suspicious activity. 6 were followers of the religious leader, Charles T. Russell, and were known as Russellites. They adopted his anti-war stance. 2 of the 6 Russellites were women members of the International Bible Students Association. Elsie Osborne of Prineville and Mrs. M.A. Thomas were arrested after distributing copies of The Watchtower. Then 3 male members of the Apostolic Christian Church were also arrested. All 9 religious objectors were released due to lack of evidence. So the wartime acts also led to an outbreak of xenophobia against certain immigrant groups. Once the U.S. entered the war, German and Austrian-Hungarian-born Oregon residents were regarded as enemy aliens. They became suspects of enhanced surveillance and were at the risk of deportation. Nearly 20,000 German adults lived in Oregon at the time. 12 of them were arrested for sedition, and 9 were convicted. Julius Ruberg, age 57, a prosperous farmer and rancher of Kent in Sherman County, was born in Germany. He was a Lutheran and married without children. Ruberg was charged with espionage after suggesting to 2 enlisted soldiers in a private conversation that they would be wise to surrender if taken to France to fight Germany. He was tried twice in federal court. The first trial ended in disagreement among the jurors, 4 of whom believed and said, look, he's an old man set in his ways and posed no real threat. Ruberg was free on bail between his first and second trials, but then he was convicted and sentenced to 15 months and a $2,000 fine. The case against Henry Albers, a multimillionaire Portland businessman and German by birth, posed challenges to the sedition law in Oregon like no other. Albers was president of the largest flour and feed milling operations on the West Coast with headquarters here in Portland. While traveling on a Southern Pacific train between Grants Pass and Roseburg, Albers started drinking heavily. Other passengers later testified that Albers made several disloyal remarks about the U.S. performance in the war. He was arrested, tried, and convicted. Albers appealed his case to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals and then to the U.S. Supreme Court. Unexpectedly, on the day the Supreme Court was to hear the case, the U.S. Solicitor General intervened to announce the government had dropped the case. He admitted, the Solicitor General, he admitted that remarks Albers made prior to his seditious comments should never have been allowed as evidence in his trial. It was an argument that revolved around earlier comments established intent. And the court and government dropped the case. The lower court decisions were set aside, making Albers a free man. Well, the government decision was explosive in Oregon. Many considered him guilty, and they thought he had received special treatment due to his wealth and status. Ironically, the American Legion went so far as to call for Marie Equie's release from prison if Albers went unpunished. The U.S. attorney in Portland was humiliated by the turn of events. He publicly questioned the outcome of all similar sedition trials. The protests over Albers only subsided after he suffered a severe stroke. He died months later. Now to the largest group. 2/3 of the 99 arrests in Oregon resulted from accusations by neighbors, colleagues, casual observers, and local officials. These are examples of the citizen policing that the federal government had encouraged. Those arrested may have had strong beliefs, but they were neither anti-war agitators nor enemy aliens. They might be characterized as unaligned dissenters. 8 of them were convicted. Many simply questioned the purpose of the war, the draft, or the obligation to subscribe to the many war-related drives, such as the Liberty Loan campaigns. Some, like Henry Albers, made intemperate remarks while under the influence of alcohol. Others disclosed their misgivings or complaints to neighbors or relatives, who then filed sedition reports with local or federal authorities. So here's a few of those cases. Dr. Nels Lund, a Swedish native with U.S. citizenship, worked as a house physician at St. Vincent Hospital in Portland. He complained in a letter to a friend in China that Americans were considered slackers if they didn't buy war bonds, and, he wrote, they were regarded no better than a German, a wobbly, or a socialist. Like the cases of Dr. Marie Equi and attorney Floyd Ramp, Lund's professional status did not shield him from arrest. He denied any intent to damage the government or its war program. His attorney requested dismissal of charges, but his trial was set for late November 1918, which became a time after the conclusion of the war. The outcome of his case was unreported. 2 wealthy Clackamas County farmers refused to contribute to the war drives. Mr. A.A. Pease was arrested after he declared he owed the country nothing, that raising crops was his contribution. Besides, he charged, the Red Cross Society was a grafting organization. Mr. I.H. Phipps, who cursed the government when approached by a war stamp salesman, met the same fate. These incidents made it clear that Oregonians were expected not only to avoid dissent, but also to prove their loyalty in ways that the majority demanded. So to recap the findings, 99 sedition arrests in 18 counties targeted the industrial workers of the world with, and resulted in 29 arrests, socialists with 5 arrests, religious war objectors with 9, enemy aliens with 12, and unaligned individuals, 44 arrests, the greatest number. And not on the slide here, of these 99 arrests, 31 are known to have been convicted. In addition to the 200 Oregon-based sedition articles, the Oregonian also published several dozen accounts of sedition arrests throughout the West. In fact, the region was the most vigilant in the nation with the greatest number of sedition cases. Oregonians might easily read a half dozen such reports every week, and these again are just in the West. The number and frequency may have spurred them to register even more reports and accusations to, in a sense, contribute to the cause. But we might also consider that all these reports about dissent and the punishment drove home the message that everyone, in fact, was under surveillance. And if so, how much did residents self-censor their political opinions and dissent? Most Oregonians, evidently, became accustomed to this surveillance. 3 months after the war ended, the state of Oregon adopted its own more restrictive version of the federal sedition law. I think it's clear that Oregon's experience with the Espionage and Sedition Acts was significant. This period was the first time that Oregonians were subjected to extensive investigation and surveillance in their daily lives. Federal agents in Portland monitored activities by radicals, and they encouraged state residents to report any disloyalty. Never before had ordinary individuals in the state collaborated so extensively with federal authorities to spy on one another. At the conclusion of Marie Equie's sedition trial, Judge Robert S. Bean advised that there were 2 classes of people in the country: those who supported the war efforts and those who did not. He advised that the choice for the latter group was simple. All the government asked was that those who did not support the war keep quiet, as if citizenship required silence. Thank you.
All right, it's your turn. Who has a question? Great. Oh, let me turn that on, actually.
Is it on?
Is there a green light on it? Yeah. It should be.
Okay.
Oh, I know what I did, forgot. So many steps to make it turn on. Okay.
Okay. Is it on? Yes. Okay. This is for Dr. Kazin, an old friend and former teacher. I recognized your voice when I was watching the OPB series on World War I. There were a couple of things that you said that I wonder if you could clarify slightly for me, and they have to do with Woodrow Wilson himself. As you said, many people don't know much about World War I, neither did I know much about Wilson. One comment you made was that he had a messianic complex. Another comment you made was that he was at once a most democratic president and a most repressive president. Now, I understand the repression part with the Espionage and Sedition Act. Could you explain a little bit more about the democratic part? Thanks, Mike.
Good questions. You know, Wilson is a fascinating guy, I think, because the different impulses warring within him. Democratic part, well, as we know, the undemocratic part at home, one of the most important ones was that he was a segregationist, as almost all Democrats were at the time, and some Republicans as well, and he allowed some of his cabinet secretaries to resegregate their government departments, especially the State Department and the Post Office Department, two of the largest ones at the time. And of course, he wasn't at all unhappy about that. In fact, endorsed them doing it. But the Democratic part, he was a progressive with a small p and a very serious one. And he, at home, supported the progressive income tax, supported 8-hour day for railroad workers, supported a lot of the settlement house work that people like Jane Addams were doing, and really wanted a democratization of American society in many ways, as long as it was only white people getting the democratization. Very important, of course, to mention that. And also in the world, I mean, the messianic part, I'm not sure I called it complex. I don't want to psychologize someone I never had a chance to psychoanalyze. but I think that he certainly believed that America was the best country in the world, that other countries should follow our lead, and that as the American president, who believed very strongly in the ideals of America and believed that its history was one of democracy, with a small d, that it should be, it was required, obligated really, to teach the world to be more democratic. And when he went to Paris in 1919, after he'd given the 14-point speech, which was, people should read it, it's a very radical speech in many ways, about a different kind of world, he was the most popular man in the world. And this was not just among Europeans and Americans, it was also among Egyptians and Chinese and Vietnamese, like Ho Chi Minh, who went to the Paris Peace Conference hoping to meet with him. This was before Ho Chi Minh was a communist. Because he was promising, a democratic world for everybody. Now, he wasn't able to follow through on it, and one can argue he didn't really believe that the victorious powers, Britain and France, were really obligated to give up their empires, even though the Germans and the Austro-Hungarians, the Ottomans certainly had to give up their empires. But, his speeches, he was an incredibly fine speaker, and his speeches really inspired people to think about a more democratic world. So the tragedy, of course, is that, as I said in my talk today, that he, in the end, was not really that neutral, and because of that, I think, inevitably, perhaps the United States got into war with Germany. And, of course, the peace treaty, for various reasons, was not ratified by Congress. But at the same time, he gave us still this, we still talk about Wilsonian democracy, Wilsonian foreign policy, which every president pretty much, until perhaps our current president, at least paid lip service to. And even our current president, has begun to pay lip service to it as well. And you can argue it's a good thing or a bad thing, but it's certainly an idea of America being a nation which goes abroad in order to make other countries more democratic. Now, I believe that has usually not happened when we've done that, and there's been a lot of problems with that, but at least better than to go into the world and enslave people, at least to say you're going to do that and make them subjects of your empire. So that's some idea. And as also, just to reiterate what I said, I think he honestly did not want the U.S. to get into the war. I think, as I said, he made decisions which perhaps led us into war even before war was actually declared, but he I think, was quite honest, sincere about wanting the United States to be an honest broker for peace until the Germans broke this agreement, as he saw it, in February 1917. Sorry for the lengthy answer, but he's a complicated guy.
Thank you. I'm particularly interested in Michael Hellquist's talk because it focuses on ourselves here in Oregon. And this morning, in the Oregonian, there was a little note saying 100 years ago, 20,000 people marched in Portland to support the war. So this is the kind of atmosphere that Michael was evoking for us. And I think it's worth considering that out of that period came some local institutions that exist today to continue to suppress dissenting opinion. The most prominent, of course, is the Portland Police Department's Red Squad, which now exists a few blocks away under the title of the Police Intelligence Unit and is responsible for the monitoring of dissenters and demonstrations and so on. So out of that period came one of the today's important institutions. And finally, in addition to Michael's compendium of people who were fired, of people who were arrested and convicted, there were quite a few victims who lost their jobs. For example, Lisa Hunt at the Portland Public Library, and Maura Norrell, a Portland public school teacher who didn't express sufficient enthusiasm for the bond drive that also snagged some other important. So I'm not sure if this is a question, but finally, with regard to the anti-German feeling, there were actually streets in Portland that were renamed during this period to remove any sense that they had Germanic origins, like Rhine and Bismarck and so on. Thank you.
This is a question for Michael Helmquist. Do you think that there's something about who settled Portland that led to this kind of thinking around World War I, connected with other kinds of attitudes in Oregon about African Americans, Japanese, Chinese? Is there something about Oregon that leads to this kind of narrow view?
Sure. The question was there something about the people who settled in Oregon that over time led to this propensity, say, to take these positions related in the war opposed to people who came to be called enemy aliens, and that same general feeling that included other groups then as well as later on? It's a good question. It's a little difficult to answer because it's broad. And I remember researching for the Marie Equi biography about the traveling to the West, which she did coming from Massachusetts to Oregon, and there were passages about how who took the train, transcontinental train. They all came to a certain point. Who took the train that veered off to Oregon, and who went to San Francisco? And the suggestion was that there was a certain character, and maybe that was a more settled character, maybe a more conservative, and perhaps that somehow led to it. Portland certainly had the reputation of being the more conservative, restrained town, say, compared to Seattle, which had a much more radical groups and activity, and the federal government put more resources in Seattle to deal with Washington radicals than the effort in Portland. So that's only glancing off your question a bit.
My question is about whether Dr. Kazin, whether the United States should have entered the war. As I'm sure you know, the British historian Max Hastings argues that Britain had to enter the war. The thought of a Kaiser's Germany winning the war and dominating continental Europe was just an unthinkable thing in retrospect. But I'm wondering what you think about the United States' involvement in the war.
That's the big question. It's one of the big questions, obviously. I've gotten in some trouble. I wrote an op-ed for the New York Times a couple of weeks ago, which one paragraph I did a counterfactual. If the U.S. hadn't entered the war, the Germans would have been negotiated a settlement, perhaps. The Germans would have won, perhaps. And whatever terrorists come from that, you probably don't get Hitler, the Nazi Party, and the genocide of World War II. But, you know, I don't want to get into that counterfactual swamp at the moment. The question is a difficult one because I think it was a war of choice for the United States. Unlike for Britain, you know, I think obviously the British, the idea of a hostile power occupying Belgium and France, which of course would have happened if the Germans had won the war. Understandably, the British could not abide by that. The United States, however, you know, I think it was a war of choice. As I said before, it was not, the United States territory was not threatened. There was some sabotage by Germans in 1916, trying to harm, of course, American material, try to stop American material from going over to Europe. But I think that one has to think very seriously about what was American self-interest in supporting this war. Of course, Wilson believed that we needed to stop a German militarism. Germany was a semi-democratic country. Britain and France were democratic countries. And he believed that, as many Americans did, even those in the anti-war movement, that the idea of Germany controlling Europe was not something they looked forward to. At the same time, you know, this is my own belief about war, that the U.S. should only enter wars, and it's true of any country, when it's in its self-interest to enter them. I define self-interest larger than just economic self-interest, obviously. It's not clear to me that even a German-dominated Europe under the Kaiser, under a Reichstag in which the largest party was the Socialist Party, would have, you know, been a threat to the United States. And of course, we'll never know what would have happened if the U.S. hadn't entered the war. But I think the people I wrote about, you know, made the argument that in order to bring about a peaceful world, one couldn't do it by humbling one of the nations fighting in this war. And of course, that happened to the Germans. Reparations were not as serious a problem as the whole idea that Germany had been the sole country at fault in the war, which the Germans had to sign the peace treaty and agree to that, as you probably know. And also the idea that, of course, the Germans were not allowed to rearm, and then when Hitler rearmed, that, of course, began the hurtling of Europe towards World War II in many ways. So, you know, I think it was not in America's, you know, self-interest in a narrow way, and perhaps not even a larger way, to go to war. And I said I wasn't going to go into the counterfactuals. Difficult not to think about the possibilities, of course, of what happened if the U.S. does not go into the war. We don't know what would have happened, but what's pretty sure is that you don't have Nazi Germany. And that, to me, would have been a good, a good result in that sense. But it's a difficult question, because obviously the war was going on. It's unclear what would have happened. All sides were exhausted. It's unclear whether the Allies would have actually lost the war if you hadn't gone in. Of course, the U.S. would have kept selling the materiel, because they were doing it anyway. So I guess I come down on saying that I think it was a mistake for the United States to enter the war. But of course, saying that depends on knowing what would have happened if we hadn't entered the war, and we can never know that. So I'm sorry if that's some ambivalent and ambiguous answer.
Talking about being a dissident to war, I'm a Vietnam veteran and opposed to war. But I went back and was reading World War I, Adam Hochschild's book, War to End All Wars. And there was, in that, at that time, entering the war, when we talk about what a rich man's war, you see that a lot of people in the military at that time, those in high positions, actually like the idea of war, the glorification of going to war and then coming back with medals and and rising up in status with people. Roger Kipling was a great supporter of the war until he lost his son. But, you know, when you think about that, what I liked about his book was to talk about the dissidents at that time, the anti-war movement at that time. So it gives you a flavor of both of those things. And when I see up here, keep quiet and not speak out, I have to ask, you know, if they had such great support for the war here, why were they so afraid?
One of the things that struck me in Michael's book was he was saying at the start of the war, if I got this right, there were 100,000 soldiers, I think, in the U.S.?
About 200,000.
200,000 and just 14 airplanes or some number like that. So with that situation, you can understand they were intending to send millions of men, and they wanted them to be well equipped and et cetera. And they wanted to make sure that nothing got in their way. They also knew that they had to have the support of the people to make it happen. I think it's just what they did with that concern and how they manipulated that concern to whip up support. And sure, with so many of these people just in Oregon as a case, who among them was really a threat to the war effort? You know, was Marie Equi a threat for giving a talk basically to her fellow travelers, in a sense, people who already believed the same thing that she did, and she talked about the war? Was that really a threat to anyone in particular? So you wonder, there is this enthusiasm for war, and we see it all the time. We see it in our own life experience. There's the adventure, there's a sense of proving manhood. There's also a sense of wanting to contribute and contribute to the national good. So all of those things come in, and there gets to be kind of a cultural dynamic, I think. And it's interesting how it shifted from the uncertainty and the expressed dissent about the war, and then, you know, so suddenly shifting to no dissent. The decisions made, we're all going forward. It's what we should do as a nation. And in some ways, that phenomenon or conclusion is pretty threatening and scary for how that happens. Sure.
Yeah, thanks for your comment. I think actually, I argue in my book that the people who were in charge of the repression did have something to be afraid of, because there was so much anti-war feeling. And the anti-war feeling that was there before the war didn't all of a sudden vanish. I mean, it's certainly true if there were public opinion polls held in May and June 1917, they would have been different from those held in February and March. I think that's certainly true. You know, Americans, like most people, once the war starts, at least at first, they get behind it. You know, that's the patriotic thing to do, and there's a lot of enthusiasm, often among young men especially, to join the war and join the army. But, you know, there was a real possibility that there would have, if anti-war Americans were able to keep speaking freely as they were able to do pretty much before war was declared, that they would have encouraged young men not to register for the draft. They would have encouraged soldiers maybe to desert before they got to France. And they would have held big demonstrations. Already, as I mentioned, even in the election of 1917, there were quite a few off-year elections in 1917, the socialists did better in major cities than they'd ever done before. And they did it not because Americans wanted socialism necessarily. It was the only way to speak out against the war. So, you know, even though we can and should, of course, you know, condemn the repression during the war, and even in retrospect, even those who supported the war thought it had gone much too far, you know, you can say in some ways it was not irrational from their point of view, because, and the Vietnam era, of course, there was much less repression against people speaking out, and it had a big impact, the anti-war movement, I think, of which I was a part. So, you know, we have to judge that too. One last thing. You know, I talked about progressivism. Robert LaFollette was progressive. Woodrow Wilson was a progressive, and it's a very broad term. Those who know American history know progressive era is always a difficult thing to define. But one of the things which is true of people who consider themselves to be progressives was they believed in democracy, but they also believed in a sense of community, which sometimes became repressive even before the war. We forget prohibition was a progressive measure, you know. It was a measure that was supported by almost all feminists, including Jane Addams. They thought that, you know, men had no right to get drunk and take money away from their children and their families, you know. And politicians had no right to own saloons, which stayed open 24 hours a day, which some of them did. And Jim Crow laws were sold as progressive in the South, better for the races to develop separately rather than to mingle with one another and cause all kinds of trouble. So progressivism 100 years ago was not the same way of thinking as sort of left liberalism is today. And people call themselves progressives today. Would have been unhappy with a lot of progressives 100 years ago.
I'm going to take one more question on this side, and then I have one more question on the other side of the room, and then we'll have individual conversation.
Okay. Yes. Your talks have focused on the war issue, being pro or anti-war. You know, these arguments came up in an America that had a lot of other social movements and things going on at the time. You know, so how much was the war question used, though, you know, important, how much was it a pretext for, you know, repression of the socialist and labor union movements that were going on at the time? And indeed, the fact that these forms of repression continued after the close of the war with the Palmer raids and so forth, and there wasn't a war anymore, lent some credence to the fact that in many ways, you know, it was serving these, you know, vested interests, both, you know, monetarily in war production and also in crushing labor unions and socialists.
Yeah, that was very much the case. And you know, I came across that information in the Pacific Northwest, how in 1905, when the IWW was first organized, from that point forward, for another 10, 12 years before the US went to war, the governors of Oregon, Washington, Idaho, and Montana got together and had a sort of solid effort and phalanx with the federal government saying, you know, you got to help us here. That was before necessarily the threat of war was there or was even thought about happening. They were concerned about their industry's health, but they were also concerned about not having to change anything they didn't want to change. So they didn't want radical influences out there demanding better working conditions or equity in any form. So that was ongoing. That was part of the struggle, and the war simply cast it in a different frame and different parameters, and that continued. And what I mentioned, that after the war, several states, I think it was 21 individual states, passed what was called criminal syndicalism laws. And basically they were state versions of the Sedition Act that were more restrictive and more punitive. And those also went after people who were threats to industry primarily, as well as to political thought and dissidents. And of course, there was the influence of the Russian Revolution, and there was concern about the Bolsheviks. But you know, there was a very strong feeling about maintaining the norms, maintaining what works best for people who didn't want change and for people who were protecting their investments.
Just to add a little bit, I mean, there was a great fear, you know, during the war, of course, of pro-German activity, and after the war, of revolutions breaking out. It wasn't just Russia. I mean, there was a revolution in Germany, which, you know, put into place the Weimar Republic, and there was almost a communist revolution led by Rosa Luxemburg, Karl Liebknecht, and there was a short-lived Bolshevik Republic in Bavaria and one in Hungary, and you know, 1919 was a year like 1968, like 1848, like 1989 in a different way. So it was a year of revolutions. And not surprisingly, people in power in the United States wanted to make sure it didn't happen here. And in Seattle, of course, you know, up the road here, before there was Highway 5, there was a general strike, which lasted about a week, if I remember, and it was a general strike not led by the IWW, which was smashed by then. It was led by the American Federation of Labor Unions up there. But some people called it the Seattle Soviet. And, so it was crushed, not in the name of necessarily of labor peace, but the name of stopping radicalism from triumphing. So, again, sometimes people who are fearful in power have something to fear.
Under the current anti-sedition laws, how many of the 100 people who were brought up for charges do you think would not have been convicted? And what does that say about the current sedition laws? Has there anybody in the past 100 years, or what's the number in the past 100 years of people who have been brought up on charges of anti-sedition?
So the question was about the effect of current anti-sedition laws in general, or if it's the Patriot Act or something like that.
And what would happen to the 100? Would they have all been convicted again under the current, or have they been altered dramatically to prevent
it's
unwarranted convictions or incarcerations?
It's hard to say. I couldn't address so much the current. I know before the war and after the war, with these more stringent sedition laws, some of the people who didn't get convicted during the wartime period probably would, because you could be convicted, you could be arrested and convicted just for gathering, just for being a member of a radical group, just having a membership card. Part of the trial with Marie Equi was she or was she not an official member of the IWW? Because that would have been in itself a criminal act. And but it was a measure of suppression against people. With Marie Equi, again, even after she had been convicted of sedition, but before she was in prison, she was arrested on the streets of Portland under the criminal syndicalism law for simply passing out a pamphlet on the street. So for a short period of time, well, for a decade or so after the war, it played out different ways and in different states for how severe dissidents were taken care of, were dealt with. So some of the people, if you're referring to the 100 that were arrested the first time around, I think most of them weren't convicted because there wasn't adequate evidence. It was sort of spurious or just not substantial enough, or perhaps that there wasn't federal resources to really proceed with their cases as much as they wanted to.
Is that the last question? Or because I just want to add one thing, sort of hopeful note, perhaps, in conclusion. Crystal Eastman, who I talked about during the war, after the American Union against militarism basically got dissolved, it really had no real role anymore, they believed. She founded with a guy named Roger Baldwin, who was an anarchist, an organization called the National Civil Liberties Bureau, the NCLB, which defended people opposed to the war, as Michael knows very well. And in 1920, that organization changed its name to an organization you've heard of, the American Civil Liberties Union. And in part because of the repression during World War I, which most Americans and most policymakers, too, thought had been a mistake, at least the severity of it, we haven't seen that kind of thing again during other wars Americans have fought. And I think also it caused a change in the Constitution. The Bill of Rights before World War I basically only applied to the federal government, not to the states. One of the reasons you could pass these laws, the syndicalism laws, was because the Bill of Rights didn't apply. The states did not have to obey them. But in a series of Supreme Court cases, in which the most important one was U.S. versus Gitlow in 1925, the court came around to doing what's called incorporating the Bill of Rights into the states. So from the 1920s onward, I'm oversimplifying the history, but certainly by the 1940s and 50s, Americans accepted that the Bill of Rights applied to every state in the Union, that you couldn't pass laws restricting free speech. Or if you did, you had to get around them in very imaginative ways, and it was very difficult to do so. So in that sense, what happened in World War I, the repression we've been talking about, I think Americans at different levels learned from that not to do it again. And that's at least a hopeful lesson. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Buy books. Make sure your membership is current, or get a membership so you get the June special section. And stick around and ask questions if you like.